Bovary, I'd like to refer you back for a moment to some of the remarks I made about the love letter form in Laclos' novel, The Liaison Dangereuse. And in particular, what I tried to get at was the incompatibility between the feeling of love, which should suggest a kind of reciprocity or mutuality, and the actual writing of a letter, which is a private, sometimes solipsistic, and frighteningly free operation. In Flaubert's book, which really can be thought of as a kind of anatomy, perhaps autopsy, of love, we look at the thing itself, not the letter form, but the actual phenomenon that we call love. I think this novel is famous in Western literature for the rather searing portrait that it gives us about love as something that may or may not exist, may or may not be possible. Could it be a construct? We want to think of love, of course, as something that's deep and vital and spontaneous and part of us. In this novel, I think we're led to question whether it could be a fabrication of sorts, and I'll talk more about what that could mean. And some of the more grisly consequences of that might be, are passion and marriage compatible? Because this is also a marriage text. That's a rough question, I think. I'm talking to you as somebody who's been married 42 years. Are passion and marriage compatible? What is the impact of time on human relationships? Those are some of the issues that I'm going to try to get into in these two lectures. Flaubert is a remarkable figure. He's got probably a whole slew of problems in his own makeup. We know that his own health was very problematic, that he had these mysterious, what people think of as seizures, very early in his life, and sort of became a hermit devoted to writing, even though he was a very attractive and vigorous young man with apparently an insatiable sexual appetite as well. So there's a lot of displacement in the figure of Flaubert himself and the way he conducted his life. He himself openly acknowledged that there was a kind of warfare inside of him between a romantic dreamer on the one hand and a realist critic, a very acerbic realist critic on the other. Another way of putting that is that Flaubert was a romantic who choked during the rest of his life on what he had absorbed. And all of his books seem to be an exploration and a punishment of desire. So Madame Bovary can be thought of as really staging the life and death of romance. And that's what I'm going to talk about a lot in this lecture. And in the next lecture, I'll talk more about its narrative complexity, which is no less interesting and important. The novel seems to display the making and unmaking of Emma Bovary. Making and unmaking, those are the words that I used, and I chose them very carefully, because it suggests that a person could be made and unmade. Again, a rather unwelcome notion. We don't want to think of ourselves as constructible and taken apartable, if you will, in that fashion. But it's not just a remark about the possible factitiousness of the individual person. It's also, I think, a comment about writing. I mean, isn't that what writers do? They make and unmake their characters. Some people have said that every time a character dies in a novel, it's a murder. After all, the character doesn't die. The author exercises his or her own volition in order to lead these characters exactly as he or she sees fit. So a lot is going to be in play here about constructedness and about power and about control in this novel. Constructedness. Emma Bovary's education takes place at a convent, and that's an absolutely critical piece of information, because the convent becomes the source of her fantasies and dreams about what reality is supposed to offer her. She is a voracious reader. She reads religious texts. She also reads romances, and she comes out of that reading as someone who is convinced that life is going to follow suit. In this regard, from a literary point of view, she follows in the footsteps of one of the great characters in earlier literature, Don Quixote, whose whole life was cued to the reading that he gave to chivalric romances, and then made the kind of tragic or hysterical, depending on how you see it, blunder of going through life assuming that everything would follow as these romances had suggested. Well, I think we can see Emma as a kind of female Quixote. She too is formed by these prior scripts that effectively serve as lenses on the world, that are the way she sees the world. This, too, is not a happy notion, it seems to me. We would like to think of our own subjectivity as something that is free and spontaneous, but what this suggests is that we are always schooled in ways that have nothing to do with the schools that we go to, our formal education, but schooled in the sense that we have either read or internalized certain kinds of doctrines, certain kinds of stories, and that we have no control over this, no awareness of it, but they nonetheless, inside of us, shape and govern how we feel. What did she read? She read sentimental fiction. She read about the religious hunger for bliss, for ecstatic states. She read about knights. She read about heroes. She read about languishing maidens. She read a lot about swooning with happiness. Well, that's how she comes out of the convent. She lives on a farm with her fairly well-to-do father, farmer, and she imagines that marriage for her is going to be, of course, the grand consummation of these dreams. She, in fact, had wanted to be married by torch ceremony at midnight. Instead, it's a huge instead. Instead, she is fated to marry the widowed country doctor, Charles Bovary. There's very little in fiction, it seems to me, that is as rigorous as Flaubert's account of Charles Bovary. In fact, the novel starts with Charles Bovary, and I'm pronouncing his name the French way because he goes into school as a child, and they ask him his name, and he says, Charles Bovary, and they think it's just one word. They don't know what it means even. And there's a long description of his bumblingness in school, and it's a bumblingness and a kind of gaucheness that never leaves him. Well, you can see that this could be a really misalliance. This could really be a bad couple, and it's exactly what's going to happen. That to be married to this man who has absolutely not a scrap of romance in him, even though he worships Emma, given the needs and given the expectations, which she does not think of at all as exaggerated, that she has for what life is supposed to give her, in particular marriage is supposed to give her, we've got a bad, bad situation on our hands. And it allows Flaubert to write a critique of marriage itself as the death of romance, marriage itself as the inexorable experience of routine and boredom, or what the French call ennui. I'd like to read you one or two passages about Charles to give you a sense of just how incisive and brutal Flaubert can be in nailing this character. Charles' conversation was commonplace as a street pavement, and everyone's ideas trooped through it in their everyday garb without exciting emotion, laughter, or thought. That may seem like a mundane phrase, but not many of us could come up with that phrase. His conversation was commonplace as a street pavement. Commonplace. Commonplace is an interesting term here, because Charles is common almost in the etymological sense that everybody else's ideas are his. That's what it means here. Their ideas troop through it in their everyday garb. There's nothing original about him. It's an insidious remark because I think the reader has to begin to wonder, well, is this just a critique of Charles? Or is in fact this a comment about human beings, that all of us are a kind of reservoir of commonplaces, of cliches, of things that have come through us? Are all of us like street pavement in that sense, that everybody else's ideas troop through? Not a particularly nice notion. Well, that view of Charles, of course, leads to further accounts of their life together, and Flaubert is famous in this book for the depictions of their married existence. He doesn't go into the bedroom because that's not where the action is for him. Instead, he goes to the sort of routine events that all married people know about, which has to do, for example, with eating a meal. I'll read you a passage about this, and I want you to hear how much is packed into this. But it was above all the meal times that were unbearable to her. In this small room on the ground floor with its smoking stove, its creaking door, the walls that sweated the damp pavement, all the bitterness of life seemed served up on her plate. And with the smoke of the boiled beef, there rose from her secret soul waves of nauseous disgust. Charles was a slow eater. She played with a few nuts or leaning on her elbow amused herself